There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a mountain after someone goes missing. It is not the peaceful silence of early morning, when mist still clings to the pine trees and the only sound is birdsong echoing off granite walls. It is not the comfortable silence of an evening campfire, when the embers crackle and friends sit close together without needing words. This silence is different, heavier. It has weight to it, the weight of unanswered questions, of search dogs moving in tight circles, of parents standing at a trailhead clutching photographs they printed at a gas station, because it was all they could do. Two teenagers set out on a hiking trail in Colorado one summer morning. They packed water. They packed trail mix and protein bars. They carried a paper map, the kind that folds badly and never quite goes back the way it came. They had done this before. They knew what they were doing. They had their whole lives ahead of them. And then they were simply gone. Not missing in the way people sometimes go missing. No final text message laced with hidden meaning. No history of running away. No family argument that might explain an absence. Just gone. The way a candle flame disappears when the wind comes through an open window. One moment present. The next, nothing. 7 years would pass. 7 years of silence. Of unanswered phone calls ringing into voicemail. Of birthday cakes that nobody felt like eating. Of a mother who kept her son's hiking boots by the front door, just in case. Of a father who drove up to that trailhead every single summer, alone, and walked until his legs gave out. 7 years. And then, on an unremarkable Tuesday in late September, a hiker named Marcus Webb was making his way down a trail he had walked dozens of times before. The recent rains had been unusual, heavy for that time of year, persistent in the way that Colorado storms sometimes are, stubborn and unhurried. The trail had changed. Soil that had been undisturbed for years had shifted, cracked open, peeled back. And Marcus Webb stopped walking. Because there, half buried in the wet earth at the side of a trail that had once been searched by helicopters and dogs and 100 volunteers, there was a hiking boot. Old, weathered, and next to it, barely visible beneath the mud, something blue. Small, familiar. This is not a story about a storm. This is not a story about two teenagers who got lost. This is a story about what the mountain was hiding. And the first mistake, the mistake that set everything in motion, was made before they ever reached the trailhead. Their names were Tyler Mercer and Brandon Holt. They were 17 years old. Tyler was the kind of kid who kept a journal. Not because anyone told him to. His English teacher had assigned journaling sophomore year and most of his classmates stopped after the first week. But Tyler kept going. He wrote about hikes. He wrote descriptions of trails, the way sunlight moved through aspen trees at different hours of the day, the way the air tasted at elevation. His mother, Linda Mercer, would later describe his journals as almost scientific, precise and detailed and full of small observations that most people would walk right past without noticing. Brandon Holt was different in the way that best friends are often different, complementary, like two halves of the same thing. Where Tyler was careful and methodical, Brandon was instinctive. He was the one who would scramble up a boulder just to see what was on the other side. He was the one who convinced Tyler, on more than one occasion, to take the longer route because the view was supposed to be worth it. Brandon's mother, Diane, would tell you that her son had been drawn to the mountains since he was old enough to walk. She had a photograph of him at age 3, standing at the edge of a meadow in the Rockies, arms out wide, face turned toward the sky like he was trying to absorb it all at once. They had been friends since 6th grade. 6 years of shared lunches and late-night phone calls and inside jokes that nobody else quite understood. They had hiked together dozens of times, real hikes, not casual weekend walks. They knew how to read trail markers. They knew how to check weather reports. They knew how to layer clothing for changing mountain temperatures. They were not reckless. That is important to understand. They were not the kind of teenagers who took risks because risks felt exciting. They took their hiking seriously. The morning they disappeared was the first Saturday of August. The weather that week had been ideal. Clear skies, mild temperatures, low wind. Tyler had been planning this particular hike for most of the summer. It was a trail in the San Juan Mountains, a stretch of rugged and beautiful terrain in southwestern Colorado that drew both experienced hikers and tourists in roughly equal measure. The trail itself was well-marked and moderately challenging. Tyler had researched it extensively. He had printed information about elevation gain, water sources, and estimated completion times. Brandon had picked Tyler up at 7 in the morning. Tyler's little sister, Emma, was eating cereal at the kitchen table when they left. She would later tell investigators that Tyler had given her a wave on the way out the door. Not a hug, just a wave, the casual kind you get when you expect to be back by dinner time. They stopped at a gas station on the way out of town. Security footage would later capture them at the counter, Brandon holding 2 energy drinks, Tyler shaking his head, probably making some comment about hydration that Brandon was choosing to ignore. They were laughing. They were easy and relaxed in the way of people who are exactly where they want to be. They reached the trailhead parking area at approximately 9:15 in the morning. Tyler's car, a 2008 Subaru Forester that his parents had bought him for his 16th birthday, was parked in the gravel lot. Another hiker would later recall seeing 2 teenage boys unloading their packs from the back of a silver Subaru. She had thought nothing of it. They looked prepared. And they were prepared for everything except what they were about to decide. Somewhere between the trailhead and the first mile marker, they found the shortcut. Or more accurately, someone had told Brandon about it. A guy he knew from a rock climbing group had mentioned it a few weeks earlier. A trail that wasn't on any map. Used by locals, he'd said. Shaves almost 4 to 5 minutes off the loop. Beautiful terrain. Nothing to worry about. Tyler, by all accounts, was hesitant. He liked having a map he could follow. He liked knowing where he was. But the morning was perfect and they were in good spirits and the shortcut was right there. A narrow path cutting away from the main trail through a dense stand of Engelmann spruce. And Brandon was already stepping toward it. That unmarked path would become the last confirmed place anyone saw them alive. Linda Moser was making pasta when her phone buzzed the first time. It was 7:15 in the evening. Tyler had said he would be home by 6:30 at the latest. Linda had already made a mental note to ask him about the extra 4 to 5 minutes. The kind of mild, low-stakes parental concern that you file away for later. She stirred the sauce and checked her phone. No new messages. She told herself it was the signal. Mountain areas were notoriously unpredictable that way. You could have full bars in one spot and nothing 20 feet to the left. Tyler had mentioned this before. She put her phone back down. By 8:30, the pasta was cold on the stove and Linda had called twice. Both calls went to voicemail. She stood at the kitchen window for a long moment, looking at nothing in particular, and then she called Diane Holt. Diane had not heard from Brandon either. They told each other the things that parents tell each other in those first hours, that boys lose track of time, that mountain trails run long, that cell service out there was famously unreliable, that they had probably just decided to catch the sunset from a high point and lost track of time. Linda agreed with all of this. She believed none of it. By 10 o'clock, she called her husband, Greg. By 11, Greg had called the county sheriff's office. The dispatcher was polite and careful. She explained that 2 adults, technically, at 17, they were considered adults in certain contexts, had not returned from a planned day hike. She noted the trailhead. She noted the vehicle. She said someone would do a welfare check in the morning unless they heard otherwise. Greg drove to the trailhead that night. He needed to do something with his hands. He drove the hour and 20 minutes on dark mountain roads and pulled into the gravel lot, and there it was, Tyler's silver Subaru Forester, exactly where it should not still be. He sat in his own car for a while and looked at it. Then he got out and looked inside. The keys were still in the cup holder. Search and rescue was activated at first light. The San Juan County Sheriff's Office coordinated with Colorado Search and Rescue, and within hours of sunrise on Sunday morning, the operation was underway. A helicopter swept the visible terrain from above. Ground teams worked in grids. Search dogs were brought in, experienced animals, trained for exactly this kind of work, capable of detecting human scent over vast distances and through significant elevation changes. Linda and Greg Mercer stood at the trailhead with Diane Holt. They had brought photographs. They had brought Tyler's sweatshirt from the back seat of the Subaru, something with his scent on it for the dogs. Linda held it in her lap and did not look at it. The helicopters came and went. The dogs moved in wide arcs through the trees. The radio traffic crackled and buzzed. Searchers checked in and moved on. The day turned from morning to afternoon to evening, and then it was dark again, and the search was suspended for the night, and nobody had found anything at all. Not a boot print. Not a piece of clothing. Not an energy drink wrapper or protein bar wrapper or a single scrap of anything that said two teenage boys had passed this way. It was the absence of evidence that unnerved the search coordinator most. Her name was Janet Ruiz, and she had run mountain searches before. People get lost in the mountains. People fall. People get dehydrated or confused or caught by weather. And when those things happen, they leave traces. They call for help if they can. They find shelter. They do something. Tyler and Brandon had done nothing that anyone could find. And then the searchers found something that made this case much darker. On the third day, a searcher named Paul Dennison found the shortcut. He almost missed it. The entrance was subtle, an opening in the spruce trees barely wide enough for two people to walk through single file. There was no marker, no cairn, nothing to indicate that a path existed. But Paul had grown up in these mountains, and he recognized the faint compression of soil that meant feet had passed this way, multiple times, over multiple seasons. He radioed it in and followed the path for about a quarter of a mile before it narrowed severely and then seemed to simply end, not at a destination, not at a junction with another trail, but at a rocky slope that dropped away sharply into a densely forested ravine below. He stood at the edge and looked down. The ravine was deep. The tree coverage was nearly total. In winter, that area would be inaccessible. Even in summer, reaching the bottom would require ropes and serious technical skill. A team was assembled. Two experienced technical climbers from the county's Swift Water and Vertical Rescue Unit descended into the ravine. It took them most of a morning. They moved carefully, looking at everything, photographing anything that seemed out of place. They found no sign of Tyler or Brandon. They found no sign of anyone. The official search lasted 11 days. During that time, teams covered more than 60 square miles of terrain. The helicopter logged over 40 hours of flight time. The search dogs were cycled out twice. Fresh animals brought in when the original teams began to tire. Volunteers came from 3 counties. On one particular day, more than 200 people fanned out across the mountainside in a coordinated grid search that took 12 hours and produced nothing. The theories emerged the way theories always do when there are no facts to anchor them, gradually, persistently, filling the vacuum left by absence. Some people believed the boys had fallen, perhaps from the shortcut's edge, and that their bodies lay in a part of the ravine the search teams had not been able to access. Others suggested wildlife. Black bears and mountain lions both inhabited the area, though a simultaneous attack on 2 healthy teenagers was considered extremely unlikely by wildlife experts. A smaller number of people, the kind who speak in lowered voices, suggested the boys might have run away, left of their own accord. Tyler's journal dismissed that theory before it was ever properly raised. The entries from the week before the hike were ordinary and unremarkable. He was excited about the trail. He wrote about the wildflowers that bloomed at that elevation in early August. He had plans for the fall, a school trip he was looking forward to, a book he was halfway through, a recipe he wanted to try making with his mother on Sunday when he got home. People who are planning to disappear do not write about Sunday dinner. Linda and Greg Mercer refused to leave the area for the first week. They rented a room at a motel 20 minutes from the trailhead and drove up every morning. Linda would walk as far as the searchers would allow, which was not very far. She stood at the edge of the authorized perimeter and looked into the trees and spoke to her son in a low voice. Not quite a prayer, not quite a conversation. Just his name, over and over, like a signal. Diane Holt went home after the first week. Her doctor advised it. She was not sleeping and she was barely eating, and her blood pressure had become a concern. She went home and sat in Brandon's room and looked at the rock climbing gear hanging from hooks on his wall. And she made phone calls to anyone who might know anything. And she waited. On the 11th day, search and rescue coordinator Janet Ruiz sat down with both families in a small conference room at the county sheriff's office. She was direct and honest and visibly pained by what she had to say. The official search was being scaled back. Resources were limited. The terrain had been covered extensively. They would continue to monitor the area. They would respond to any new information immediately. But the active, coordinated search was ending. Greg Mercer stood up and walked out of the room without a word. Linda stayed seated. She looked at Janet Ruiz for a long moment, and then she said, very quietly, "Something happened to them. Someone knows what happened. And I'm going to find out what it was." After weeks of searching, the families were left with silence, and a question no one could answer. The case was downgraded to inactive status in November of that year. That is the official language for what happens when a missing persons case has no new leads, no new evidence, and no active investigative threads. Inactive. It does not mean closed. It means waiting. It means a file sitting in a drawer, a name in a database, a family in a kind of suspended grief that the rest of the world does not have a good word for. The trail reopened the following spring. Hikers returned. The summer brought tourists and trail runners and families with young children doing their first real mountain hike. The shortcut, unmarked and unofficial, was still there, still used occasionally by people who didn't know its history, which was most people, because most people didn't know there was a history to know. The news cycle moved on, as it always does. The story of two missing teenagers in Colorado was picked up by regional outlets, then a couple of national ones, then quietly set aside when newer, louder stories came along. There was a short segment on a true crime podcast a year after the disappearance. The hosts were respectful and thorough, and it generated a few tips that were dutifully followed up and led nowhere. But the families did not move on. They could not, and they would not. Greg Mercer hired a private investigator in the second year, a former Colorado State Patrol officer named David Okafor, who had a reputation for being thorough and skeptical in equal measure. David spent 4 months reviewing the search records, re-interviewing witnesses, and making his own trips into the mountains. He identified several areas that he felt had not been adequately searched, particularly the zone around the shortcut's exit point, where the terrain dropped sharply into the ravine. He noted in his report that the soil in that area had a particular composition, dense clay overlaid with forest litter, that could potentially preserve organic material for extended periods. The sheriff's office reviewed his report. They acknowledged his concerns. They did not reopen the search. David Okafor, for his part, drove back up to that mountain on his own time. He walked the shortcut from end to end, slowly, twice. He stood at the edge where the path dropped away and looked down into the ravine below. He took photographs. He made notes. He told Greg Mercer that his gut said something had happened at or near that location, but that gut feelings were not evidence and he could not prove anything. Linda Mercer started a nonprofit in the third year. Its purpose was practical. It funded search operations for missing persons in remote terrain, specifically in cases where official resources had been exhausted. She named it after both boys. She raised money and coordinated with search and rescue professionals and attended every training she could find. She became, in ways she had never anticipated, an expert in the mechanics of wilderness search operations. She also kept walking that trail. Every summer, without exception, she drove to the trailhead and walked the route Tyler had planned to hike. She walked slowly. She looked at everything. She carried a photograph of Tyler in her jacket pocket. She never found anything, but she kept looking. In the 6th year, Diane Holt was diagnosed with an autoimmune condition that had doctors linked, at least in part, to chronic stress. Brandon's younger brother, Marcus, had grown from a boy of 11 at the time of the disappearance into a young man of 17, the same age Brandon had been. Marcus had taken up hiking. He did not walk the trail where his brother disappeared. He found other trails, in other ranges, and he walked them alone with music in his ears and his brother's photograph in his wallet. He would later say that hiking made him feel close to Brandon, that he understood, out there, why his brother had loved the mountains so much. One detail that investigators had noted and then, in the press of other things, perhaps underweighted, the area directly adjacent to the shortcut's exit point, that steep slope leading into the ravine, had never been excavated. The technical rescue teams had descended into the ravine itself, but the soil along the slope, the narrow, unstable ledge where the path ended, had never been systematically dug into. It was steep enough to be difficult. The clay composition made it liable to shift. The working assumption had been that if the boys had gone over the edge, their remains would be in the ravine below, not buried in the slope itself. That assumption, as it turned out, was wrong. 7 years after 2 teenagers vanished, a routine discovery would reopen everything. Marcus Webb was not looking for anything. He was 43 years old, a civil engineer from Durango who hiked on weekends when the weather allowed. He knew the San Juan Mountains well, had been hiking them for 15 years, knew the trail system, understood the terrain. He was coming down from a peak he had summited that morning, moving at a comfortable pace, thinking about nothing in particular. The September rains that year had been genuinely unusual. A meteorologist later described the precipitation pattern as a 1-in-30-year event for that region. Not catastrophic flooding, but sustained, heavy rainfall over a period of 3 weeks that had saturated the soil and triggered significant erosion throughout the mountain area. Landslides were documented in several locations. Trail damage was widespread. The Forest Service had crews working to clear debris and reassess trail conditions. Marcus was moving through a section of trail that he had always found slightly uncomfortable. The path narrowed near an old shortcut entrance, and the slope to the left dropped away steeply. He had walked this section dozens of times without incident. But today the trail surface was different. The recent rains had washed away the top layer of compacted soil, exposing the earth beneath, and in several places the trail edge had crumbled inward. He was being careful, watching his footing, when he saw it. It was the boot that registered first, the shape of it, partly submerged in mud, the rubber sole visible from the trail edge. Old, clearly old. The leather had darkened and cracked in the way that years of exposure and moisture would cause. He stopped and looked at it without touching it. His first thought was that someone had lost it years ago. His second thought, following almost immediately, was that it was buried rather than resting on the surface. The angle was wrong for something that had simply fallen. Then he saw the blue. A small piece of fabric, perhaps 4 inches visible, the blue of it still recognizable despite the mud coating. It was wedged beneath the boot, or beside it. He couldn't quite tell from where he was standing. Something about it made him stop breathing for a moment. He took photographs with his phone. Then he climbed back up to where he had better signal, and he called the San Juan County Sheriff's Office. The deputy who took the call was 27 years old and had joined the department only 2 years earlier. He had grown up in Colorado, and he had heard of the Mercer Holt case. It was part of local history in the way that certain unresolved things become part of local history. He drove to the trailhead and hiked out to the location Marcus Webb had described with GPS coordinates. He stood at the trail edge and looked at what Marcus had found. Then he got back on the radio. Within 4 hours, the trail had been closed. Within 6, a forensic team from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation had driven through the night from Denver. Yellow tape, portable lights, a perimeter established around a section of slope approximately 30 meters long and 10 meters wide. The team moved carefully and quietly in the darkness, documenting everything before anything was touched. The lead forensic examiner, a woman named Dr. Sarah Kowalski who had worked over 200 scene investigations, knelt at the edge of the perimeter and studied the boot for a long time before she spoke. Then she said, simply, that they needed to expand the excavation area, because what they found next would confirm everyone's worst fear. The excavation took 4 days. Dr. Kowalski's team worked in controlled stages, the way archaeologists work, in careful layers, with hand tools, documenting every centimeter as they went. The soil was dense and damp from the recent rains, but the clay composition that made excavation difficult had also, as David Okafor had observed years earlier, created a kind of preservation environment. Things buried in that soil would decay slowly. On the first morning, they carefully extracted the boot. It was a size 10 men's hiking boot, a brand no longer manufactured, a style discontinued several years earlier. The sole was partially intact. Inside, pressed flat against the insole by years of compression, was a folded piece of paper, deteriorated, fragile, but legible in parts. It was a section of a printed trail map. In the margin, in handwriting that Tyler's mother would later identify immediately as her son's, were 2 words: West Ridge. Beside the boot, the blue fabric was extracted next. It was a bandana, the kind hikers carry for a dozen practical purposes. It was Brandon's. His mother recognized the pattern without hesitation. She had given it to him for his birthday the spring before he disappeared. On the second day, the excavation deepened. The team worked in silence for the most part, the particular focused silence of people engaged in something grave and consequential. The sloped soil shifted in distinct layers as they went deeper, and Dr. Kowalski noted in her log that the disturbance pattern was inconsistent with natural erosion. The layers were wrong. Soil that should have been arranged in a certain order, the way undisturbed ground always arranges itself, had been mixed, as if someone had dug into it, as if someone had buried something. The realization came slowly, the way unwanted realizations often do. First as an uncomfortable feeling, then as a hypothesis, then as a certainty that settled over the excavation team like cold weather. This was not the site of an accident. This was not a place where 2 teenagers had fallen and come to rest and been covered over time by natural forces. This was a burial site. On the 3rd day, they found the remains. They were in poor condition, as remains are after 7 years in mountain soil, but they were identifiable. Dental records would later provide formal confirmation, but Dr. Kowalski did not need dental records to know what she was looking at. She had the bandana. She had the trail map. She had a boot with a name written in marker on the inside heel, a practice many experienced hikers adopt, so their gear can be returned if lost. The name was T. Mercer. She stood up and walked to the edge of the perimeter and called the lead investigator and told him what they had found. Then she went back to work. There was more to do. The families were notified on the afternoon of the 3rd day. The notifications were made by the San Juan County Sheriff personally, a man named David Castillo who had been in the job for 12 years and had never had to make a call like this one. He drove to Linda and Greg Mercer's home in person. He knocked on the door and Linda opened it and looked at his face, and she knew. She did not cry at first. She just nodded, slowly, and said, "Tell me everything." But the most disturbing finding was still ahead. On the 4th day of excavation, the team completed their documentation of the burial site. And what the documentation showed was this. The location was within 100 meters of where the official search teams had worked in that first terrible week. The dogs had been in that area. The helicopters had flown over it. 200 volunteers had searched within half a mile. And somehow, through a combination of difficult terrain, dense soil cover, the inaccessibility of the slope, and perhaps simply the worst kind of luck, the site had gone undetected. But there was something else. Something that changed the nature of this case fundamentally. The burial was deliberate. The physical evidence was unambiguous on this point. The soil disturbance, the depth of the burial, the arrangement of the remains. Dr. Kowalski's report would later state, in clinical and precise language, that the burial could not have resulted from natural processes. It had been done by human hands. And investigators now believe this wasn't an accident at all. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation reopened the case under a homicide classification. That word, homicide, changes everything. It changes the investigative resources available. It changes the legal authority to compel cooperation. It changes the nature of the questions being asked, and by whom, and with what urgency. Lead investigator was assigned to a detective named Maria Santos, 22 years with CBI, specializing in cold case homicides. She received the evidence documentation from the excavation and spent 3 days reading everything before she made a single call. Then she started over from the beginning. The physical evidence told a partial story. Tyler and Brandon had made it to the shortcut's exit point. That much was clear from the location of the remains, which placed them on the edge of the slope where the path ended. The cause of death could not be fully determined from the condition of the remains after 7 years, but trauma indicators were present on both sets of skeletal remains, the kind of trauma consistent with a significant fall or a significant blow. The deliberate burial was the central mystery. Falls do not bury themselves. Whatever had happened at the edge of that slope, whatever had ended the lives of 2 17-year-old boys on a summer morning, there had been someone else present afterward. Someone who had covered what had happened. Someone who had walked away. Detective Santos built a new timeline from the fragments available. Tyler and Brandon had left the main trail and entered the shortcut sometime mid-morning on that Saturday. The shortcut's exit point was approximately 40 minutes of walking from the main trail. They would have reached it around midday, at the latest. Their car was at the trailhead. No witnesses had come forward to place anyone else at the trailhead that morning. But absence of witnesses is not the same as absence of people. She went back to the original witness list. 14 people had come forward in the days after the disappearance with information about what they had seen at or near the trailhead that morning. She re-interviewed every one of them. Most of the accounts were consistent with what had already been documented. Other hikers, a family with young children, a trail runner who had been on the main route most of the day. But one account, buried near the back of the original file, caught her attention. A man in his early 40s, a local, had mentioned seeing a pickup truck in the trailhead parking area when he arrived at approximately 8 in the morning. The truck was gone by the time he returned to his own car at early afternoon. He had not thought much of it at the time. Trucks in trailhead parking lots were completely unremarkable. But he had noted, almost as an afterthought, that the truck had been parked oddly, not in a designated space, but partially on the access road, as if it had pulled in quickly and not bothered with parking properly. Santos pulled this thread. Reconstructing the movements of a vehicle in a rural trailhead area 7 years after the fact, with no security cameras and limited electronic trail, was painstaking work. Santos spent weeks on it. She obtained records from a Forest Service camera installed on a nearby access road. The camera had been operational that day and captured license plate data from vehicles using the road, though the original search team had reviewed this footage and found nothing conclusive. Santos reviewed it again, with different eyes and a different question. She was not looking for Tyler or Brandon. She was looking for who else had been there. She found a vehicle, not the same one each time, but a pattern of the same registration appearing in the area on multiple occasions over a period of years before the disappearance. A local registration, a name she did not immediately recognize. She kept pulling. The investigation was ongoing as of the filing of this account. The details of what Detective Santos found, the identity of the person whose movements she traced, the theory of what happened at the edge of that slope, have not been fully disclosed publicly, in deference to an active legal process. What is known is this. Investigators believe that Tyler and Brandon encountered another person on the shortcut that day. What began, perhaps as words, perhaps as a confrontation, perhaps as something else entirely, ended with both boys dead at the edge of a slope in the San Juan Mountains. And then someone had stayed behind long enough to make sure they would not be found. The sophistication of the concealment and the terrain chosen suggested familiarity with that mountain. Not a tourist, not a casual hiker, someone who knew the soil, someone who knew the geography, someone who understood that the clay in that slope, under the right conditions, would hold a secret for a very long time. Justice would come, but not in the way anyone expected. There's a memorial for Tyler Mercer and Brandon Holt on a small plateau not far from the main trailhead. It is not officially sanctioned by the Forest Service. It grew organically, the way these things sometimes do, from rocks stacked by visitors and small objects left by people who wanted to mark something. 2 hand-painted wooden signs with their names. A photograph in a weatherproof frame. Wildflowers in summer. Linda Mercer visited it for the first time in the fall of the year the remains were found. She drove up alone, early in the morning, before the trailhead filled with other hikers. She walked to the plateau and stood at the memorial and looked at Tyler's photograph, his school picture from junior year, the one where he was laughing at something off camera, the way he always seemed to be laughing in photographs, and she spoke to him for a while. She did not record what she said. Some conversations are private. The formal identification brought both families something that 7 years of uncertainty had withheld: the ability to grieve. Not to finish grieving. That is not how grief works, and anyone who tells you otherwise has not lost a child. But to begin. To hold a funeral with a body to bury. To stand at a grave and say goodbye to something physical, something real, something that had not simply vanished into Mountain A. Tyler's funeral was held on a Saturday in October. It was a small service, family and close friends, at a church his family had attended since he was a child. His English teacher came and read a passage from one of his journal entries, the one about aspen trees in autumn light, which she said was the most beautiful piece of prose she had read from a student in 20 years of teaching. His little sister Emma, now 24, held her mother's hand throughout and did not let go. Brandon's service was held the following weekend. Diane Holt had asked for the same hymn that had been sung at her own parents' funerals, and when the congregation reached the 3rd verse her voice broke and her youngest son Marcus put his arm around her, and they stayed that way for the rest of the service. The aftermath brought scrutiny of the original search operation, scrutiny that was uncomfortable and necessary, and conducted with the understanding that the people involved had acted in good faith with the resources and methods available to them. Janet Ruiz, the original search coordinator, gave a lengthy interview to a documentary filmmaker working on the case. She was direct about the limitations. The slope adjacent to the shortcut exit had been assessed as unstable and dangerous to excavate without specialized equipment. The dogs had been worked hard in that area, but the clay soil and the depth of any buried material would have significantly reduced the strength of any sense signature available to them. The helicopter thermal imaging had not covered that specific slope at the angle and altitude necessary to detect disturbed soil patterns. None of this was an excuse. She did not offer it as one. She offered it as information, as the kind of honest accounting that might, one day, allow search teams to do better. Linda Mercer's nonprofit subsequently funded the development of a training module for search and rescue teams specifically addressing how to assess and excavate unstable slope terrain in missing persons cases. It has since been adopted by search and rescue programs in several states. The mountain had kept it secret for 7 years. What ultimately gave it up was not sophisticated technology, not a breakthrough in investigative methods, not a witness who finally decided to speak. It was rain, a season of unusual rainfall that moved soil, changed terrain, and brought to the surface something that human beings have been unable to find. There is something in that which is difficult to articulate cleanly, the way that nature, indifferent and unhurried, eventually undoes human concealment. The way that time, which feels like an enemy in the acute phase of loss, eventually becomes something else. Not a friend, but a process, a movement in one direction only, carrying everything with it, unable to hold anything back forever. Tyler Mercer kept a journal because he paid attention to the world. He noticed the way light changed at elevation. He noticed the specific blue of sky above 10,000 feet. He noticed small things and wrote them down because he understood, in the way that some 17-year-olds intuitively do, that the small things were worth preserving. He would have noticed the wildflowers on the plateau where his memorial stands. He would have had something precise and observant to say about them. Brandon Holt, who loved the mountains enough to scramble up any boulder just to see what was on the other side, Brandon would have understood, maybe, that the mountains are not cruel. They are simply vast and indifferent and patient in the way of things that have existed for millions of years. They keep what they keep. And then, one September morning after an unusual rain, they give it back. Linda Moser still drives to the trailhead every summer. She still walks as far as she is able. She no longer walks to look for Tyler. She walks to remember him. There's a difference, she has said, and the difference matters. She brings wildflowers for the memorial. She brings two. Always. One for Tyler, one for Brandon. She leaves them in the rocks where the painted signs are, and she walks back down the mountain in the morning light, and she carries her son with her, the way she always has, the way she always will. Nature can hide truths for years, but time has a way of revealing them. In the end, the mountains kept their secret for 7 years. A bandana, a boot, a name written on an insole. Two boys who love the mountains, brought home at last. If this story stayed with you, do you think the search could have found them sooner? What would you have done differently? These are the questions worth asking. Stories like this one deserve to be remembered, and the families deserve to know they are not forgotten. Subscribe.